I'm doing a quick conversation here with Silvia Kreibiehl. Thank you, Silvia, for joining me.
Thank you.
And Silvia is the co-head of the Frankfurt School UNEP Collaboration Center for Climate and Sustainable Energy Finance. A little bit of an emphasis on finance, where your expertise also lies.
Exactly.
So maybe just to get started, what is your main engagement here at Innovate for Climate? And you just ran an interesting workshop on how to encourage private sector finance and private sector engagement in the adaptation question.
Yeah, so traditionally our background was also mitigation finance, but we found that much more research and discussion is needed also in the adaptation segment. And I'm coming from the private sector, so I was always interested in the role of the private sector in adaptation, because the international debate is very much focused on grant funding, how much money needs to be transferred from the global north to the global south. And in our session we actually wanted to focus on a completely different perspective, and what can the private sector do, and what's the responsibility of the private sector, but also what's the business case for the private sector.
And this is very much within the framing that we're seeing more and more climate impacts. Mm-hmm. We're at 1.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, but we are already seeing more energy in the climate system. We're seeing more violent storms. We're seeing more dramatic downpours of precipitation. And all these are having an effect on the viability of businesses, on the viability of society to function in large. So what were the main issues that were being discussed from a business perspective? How can businesses be a part of managing these increasing climate impacts that we're starting to witness?
Yeah. As I mentioned before, I mean, in the international debate, we are focusing very much on the most vulnerable people and the communities. What can we do to reduce the suffering at their end? We focused a little bit more on the business perspective. So in a globalized world, think about global supply chains. What's the impact of extreme weather events? And you won't only see the impact in the developing countries, but when we import goods, we also import, of course, the effects of the extreme weather events. And we had a very interesting input from Frankfurt School's very own Professor Oliver Schenker on the impact of extreme weather events and climate change on the GDP in developing countries, but also the developed world. And this is a quite massive impact. And shouldn't this be a driver for increased adaptation finance? And then putting that in the perspective of the private sector, if the private sector will face such issues, shouldn't the private sector itself invest in adaptation?
And what do you think? Should the private sector invest in adaptation?
I think in many aspects this is a communication issue. We presented the case of Philips lighting. Philips was at the forefront of responding to regulatory changes in the lighting sector, so the phase out of the light bulbs and the stronger deployment of LED technology. When you ask these guys, well, was this restructuring of your company driven by climate change? They will tell you, what? Why climate change? No, it was just a normal management discussion, and we decided to adjust the strategy to make sure that we can also operate in future on a profitable basis. And then we had a more intense discussion with them, and the outcome was, yes, this is the adaptation we want to see in the private sector, but a normal manager would not call it adaptation. For them it's like, I have to manage my business, and I have to make sure that we can also operate in the next 10, 15 years. So I think we have to learn to speak the same language in that context, and private sector already responds to climate change. There could be more, and certainly we have to raise awareness in the north, but also in the south, and we have to make sure that also the real economy in our partner countries, in the least developed countries and emerging economies have the chance to react and to change their business model, because otherwise more or less the GDP growth would again happen in developed countries, because they can adapt faster and quicker than our partner countries.
Absolutely. And besides preventing supply chain disruptions, what kind of messages are you getting from the business sector in terms of decarbonization and decarbonizing the supply chain? What are the general trends? Is there a big uptake? Is there more finance flowing? And are managers within the private sector being more aware of these issues?
Yeah, now we are talking more again about the mitigation part of this of the Paris Agreement, and I think the Paris Agreement sent a very, very strong signal. I think it was supported by many private sector companies. I think this was very different compared to the Copenhagen Accord, where we have seen the private sector being rather skeptical, and now they have rather pushed for a strong agreement. We also see that they are willing to invest in new technologies, but I think we still need to translate those nationally determined contributions and the Paris Agreement into regulations and laws on the ground to create these concrete investment opportunities. So many companies tell us that they would be ready to deploy new technologies. Also Philips Lighting, they are ready to provide LED technologies. They are even ready to provide the financing, but there are no bankable business cases at this point in time. So in many countries, we need to foster the demand for low carbon technologies. Just think about the transportation sector, for example. Yeah, I think in the energy sector, the case is there, and in most countries, there is a good business case for renewable energy investments. We need to work more on other sectors now, transportation, lighting, and so on.
And building and heating and cooling.
Energy efficiency, in particular in energy efficiency, I think we need some more regulatory support, increasing the awareness. We, for example, see in some of our developing countries now mandatory energy audits for large companies. And these energy audits then raise the awareness, and then management is more in a position to make a positive decision to invest in energy efficiency.
Absolutely. And you're also an educator, and you have a cohort of students who are engaging in the climate and renewable energy finance discussion. So since we're live on Facebook, maybe what is your message to a younger audience? How can they be a part of this grand transition to a low carbon resilient future? How can they embrace climate and renewable energy finance?
I think for them it will be the business as usual. It will be they will live and they will work in a zero emission environment. So they need to get ready now. And this is also the discussion we have at the university. I mean, it's our duty now to educate students which are ready for this zero emission economy. So we have to mainstream all of these thoughts. And for them, it will be the new normal. I think it doesn't make sense to spend too much time on the economy as it is right now, but get ready for the transformation.
And you've heard it from Silvia. Thank you so very much, Silvia Kreibiehl. We are in the midst of a transformation. Young people are at the forefront of it. And in many ways, we're also inspired by your students. Thank you so very much for the discussion.
Thank you for having me.